Well, good afternoon, and Sanbonani and Dumalang to all of you, and thank you for a very generous introduction, Derek. I thought as co-criminals we don't get those kinds of introductions. To the Timor family, as somebody who grew up in the 1970s politically, the death of Ahmed Timor was an important rallying point and consciousness-raising point for all of us. So once again, our tribute to you for your resilience and for the good results that you had from the inquest. I'm going to do something slightly different from the chair and recognize a few of the older people, me being relatively young still. Isu Chiba, who has always been an inspiration for us. Barbara Hogan. You see, there's not only two ex-ministers, fired ministers, there's the third one as well. We're making a habit out of this. And to Uncle George Bezos, it's nice to have you here as well. Thank you very much for the privilege of presenting some thoughts. It certainly isn't a lecture on how we recapture our democratic state and the kind of leadership and activism that's going to be required and is currently being practiced for us to execute this very difficult process, given the kind of challenges that we face, but challenges that we have to overcome if we are to rebuild and rekindle the transformation momentum in South Africa, which we sorely need. Comrade Kathy's boldness in challenging the deteriorating leadership values and standards in his organization, the ANC, and in government, released what I may call the pent-up frustration and anxiety that many here and outside of this room would have felt for some time amongst the progressives and activists, and anxiety about the kind of values that were underpinning the leadership practices that we were seeing unfolding over the last few years. The weeks that followed his passing this year also opened a new chapter of public awareness and inquiry, and into what appeared to be unrelated and isolated events. When we connect the dots, as we've been saying in recent times, and there's many, many more dots to collect, ladies and gentlemen and comrades, we very quickly expose the evil scheme to defraud our nation, corrupt our government, and betray potentially our sovereignty as well. I have no unique wisdom or insight into these matters, but the direct and indirect experience both myself and others have gained in government and outside have provided challenging and some thought-provoking lessons that we could share this afternoon and debate amongst ourselves. And amongst those lessons is that the quality of leadership and the values that underpin what leaders do does matter, and a point I'll come back to. That the ideas and strategies that leaders pursue either take a country like ours onto the high road, so to speak, or begin to take us onto a low road of declining economic growth, declining job creation, increasing poverty, and increasing inequality, all of which we don't need, given the legacy that we actually have. And in a sense, we should also bear in mind that whilst we talk about leaders and leadership, leaders don't grow up in isolation. They're not born with the DNA of leadership. Some are, I suppose, and we have had some exceptional people in that regard, and very fortunate to have them in our ranks. But leaders are largely molded by the teams of people that they work with, the kind of organizational culture that they work within, and in particular, the way in which they interact with and learn from the society at large. And I'm sure Comrade Kathy and Comrade Madiba would say quite willingly that this is what has shaped them over the years. Comrade Madiba said that, there's no easy walk to freedom, and I think we're realizing that whilst 1994 was relatively easy to get to, true human freedom, true social justice, and true democracy is still going to take us a slightly longer walk. And depending on what we do in the years and months to come, perhaps sometimes even weeks to come, that will determine the shape and the quality of democracy, sovereignty, and standard of living that our people will enjoy in our country. So perhaps one of the things that you might want to share with us and the program director, and I'm sure Judith will refer to this as well, is what is it that was so special about the Madiba generation, the Madibas, the Sisulus, the Kathradas, and the Tambo leadership group? What is it that got them to stand out amongst leaders, but also amongst South Africans and indeed many people in the world as well? And what was so special that they actually had to offer, which today we could use as a benchmark and as a standard to judge all of ourselves by, in a sense? I came across some interesting material written by two academics, Asimoglu and Robinson, that many of you would know, who have written the book, Why Nations Fail. And one of the points that they make, amongst several that I'm going to mention, and I quote, "It is hard to understand Nelson Mandela's huge impact on South African politics and beyond without incorporating leadership, which we've just spoken about, and ideas into our general political economy paradigm." They say Mandela showed great leadership in steering the anti-apartheid struggle, in negotiating the transition from apartheid to democracy, and then later in bringing about some partial reconciliation, interesting observation, between black and white South Africans. That means we still have work to do. Mandela was also so transformative for South African politics because he changed people's ideas about what should be done and what could be done. He did this in his fight against the apartheid regime, and then with his efforts to define South Africa as a rainbow nation, although many of us today contest that notion and are struggling to understand how we go beyond this particular concept. So I think the important point they're making is that leaders come with ideas and leadership groups come with ideas. And today, and in the last, say, 2 years or so, we've seen how an ideas factory almost develops in order to influence society more generally, in order to legitimize what at first instance is actually illegitimate activity. So narratives around white monopoly capital, radical economic transformation, using the favorite channels that I'm sure all of you watch and don't watch, are the ones that would be used to transmit, together with my good friends, digital technology. What do you call it? Twitter. He gets himself into a lot of trouble as a result. And all of these, with fake Twitter accounts, fake news, and as we heard a little while ago, the help of the Bell Pottingers of the world, and in today's terms, the help of the KPMGs as well. I hope there's no accountants in the audience. We actually see the phenomenon of state capture playing itself out. But the question for us is, having had the legacy that we've had from this generation of powerful leaders who had a powerful vision for our country, articulated best in the Freedom Charter, who were uncompromising on principles of democracy, otherwise they would have been released from prison much earlier. It's because they stood for certain democratic principles that they remained for between 18 and 27 years on Robben Island and similar places. They understood as a leadership what it meant to be uncompromising on principles of democracy whilst being flexible in tactics, something that we've debated many, many times in the struggle in different contexts. They understood what it meant to gain true sovereignty and ensure that we don't, through our own greed, sacrifice that sovereignty and go to Washington and say, please help me because I want to help others steal money from the government. They understood what non-racialism and non-sexism meant, and they understood and practiced above all what relentless struggle meant as well in an uncompromising way. And transforming our economy and society and introducing fundamental concepts of social justice, both in theory and in practice, was their hallmark and constituted part of the model, if you like, that they presented to us. So we've had some of the greatest leaders of the 20th century in our midst. And the question is, what happened to the values that they taught us? What happened to the humility that they actually practiced? And above all, what happened to the honesty that they introduced both into our politics and into our public life? Of course, many of you will recall that President O.R. Tambo warned that, fighting for liberation might be a lot easier than running a government after liberation. because that's when the true contradictions based on new vested interests begins to actually emerge. And he warned us that new types of conflicts will arise, which will be difficult to manage, and the kind of unity and efforts that people like him put into that unity is something that would have to be invested in a lot more. But today, ladies and gentlemen, we face a situation that, oddly enough, a good friend of mine sent me a quotation from Marcus Cicero, a Roman politician and philosopher. But listen carefully, because I think it has some interesting relevance for us. And I quote, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gates freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not as a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men." And I think he includes women in this too, unfortunately. "He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist." End of quotation. I'm sure you will be wondering whether this was written in 50 or 60 BC or yesterday. Because it certainly has, I'm sure you'd agree, resonance with where we stand today. But on the basis of what Cicero says, we can also say that we, as South Africa, and as the ANC, that is committed to a program called the National Democratic Revolution to fundamentally transform South Africa's economy, to make sure that our nation is a nation of people living in decency and in human dignity, and that everybody has access to a proper income that affords them that dignity. That whilst that was our aspiration, what we in fact face is what Cicero would describe in today's terms as a counter-revolution. A counter-revolution characterized by state capture, characterized by political decline in terms of our political morality and deception, the economic sabotage that is going on at the moment through SOEs and various other mechanisms, where we don't give the kind of certainty that is required, whether it is to a small business person or whether it is to a big business person, so that they would invest and grow their businesses and create jobs in South Africa. There we have the plundering of state resources, because that's what essentially state capture is about, so that a few benefit, and without having any regard whatsoever to the impact that the stealing of these resources have for the poor. We have a deliberate weakening of the state and its developmental role. So in theory, we have a wonderful national development plan that says that one of the key components of our vision towards 2030 is a developmental and capable state. And yet, just in this past week, another Director General has been suspended. And as far as I know, and I've worked with this gentleman, he is a gentleman, he is an honest guy. What is it that he did to be rewarded, inverted commas, with a suspension, together with other officials in the department as well? So there's an element of impunity that's developing, an element which says, I don't care what happens as long as I serve myself and serve my interests at the end of the day. What kind of long-term damage is this counter-revolution actually doing in destroying state capacity? Because state capacity, together with the partnerships that we need to build with civil society, trade unions, and business, is going to be absolutely critical if we're going to achieve 5% growth, if we are to create millions of jobs, particularly for unemployed young people, if we are to find the money for the vocational training institutions in our society, or even for fees at universities as well. So I think it's important that we keep asking the question, what does state capture mean for so-called ordinary South Africans? Because often this is a concept that hangs out in the air and appears to be difficult to concretize. So let me attempt a few. Because money is being looted from Eskom, Ordinary citizens, small businesses and large businesses will be paying higher electricity charges. I believe they've just applied for an increase of between 14 and 18%. Built into this 14 and 18% is the extra price they were willing to pay for coal. The same cheap quality coal, I heard the other day from people who know better about this, that was being bought at some 300 odd rands per ton, and then suddenly increased to over 700 rands per ton, because there were some friends, they appeared in that cartoon earlier, from whom this coal was actually going to be purchased. So the cost of living increases, the cost of doing business in South Africa increases, and that impacts on our ability to sustain jobs and create jobs in our economy. So you and I and the ordinary citizens of South Africa are now expected to pay in the form of electricity tariffs and charges for those billions of rands that are being stolen from Eskom. How nice. They don't have to worry. If they need more money, just get it from, the PIC or somewhere else and put it into that same pot again. It still has the sieve at the bottom of that pot through which that money is actually going to leak. Because of the contracts for locomotives and trains, you know about those contracts. I don't know why you don't get involved in these deals. You can get 8 to 10 million rands commission for every 50 million rand train or coach. That's, and you don't have to do anything in the bargain. So think about it as a business proposition as we go forward. And again, because of the way in which these contracts are crafted, ask Comrade Popo Molefe about his experiences in PRASA, and he will explain how the leakage from PRASA actually happened and how it undermined what was supposed to be the creation of an effective public transport system in a spatially divided and spread out South Africa. Because the boards and management teams of state companies are full of people, and they also have very honest people in those institutions as well, but at the top, they are there to serve the looters. Good black professionals that are honest will constantly be moved out of these institutions, whereas we're supposed to be cultivating them, giving them greater experience so that we transform both the boards and the management teams, both in the private sector and in the public sector as well. And now you're going to see good professionals, and are seeing good professionals in government who are getting excellent training and opportunities. But if you're honest, out you go. You don't have a place within that kind of environment. So instead of having a developmental state that is serving the South African people, we have many state organs that have people who must actively support corruption, or they will be suspended, they will be fired, they will be charged, as the report from Professor Swilling and other academics indicates. But equally, for those who require roads so that they can actually access commercial opportunities in rural or small towns, you won't get that, because then no roads won't get built, water is not supplied, school books and food that is meant for our children don't actually arrive. And today we are even in a situation where school nutrition schemes are undermined. Doesn't matter if the children go hungry, as long as somebody's pocket is actually filled at the end of the day. Most tragically of all, instead of managing our economy and directing our economy in a way that will create jobs and create confidence to bring in more investment, implement really broad-based and deep transformation of our over-concentrated economy, and implement this in a vigorous kind of way, only a select few, benefit from the little economic growth that we see at this point in time. Nor are we able to lead in an imaginative way the process of restructuring our economy so that it can be more modern, more in line with the opportunities that are around in the world, and create the conditions for a massive growth of startups, of technology hubs, of small businesses and medium-sized businesses that can go out there and compete in the world. So, what do we do about these? Because these are facts that are known to you, and I'm sure you'll actually talk about them. There's a few suggestions that emerge that you might want to debate this afternoon. And they address the question, how do we recapture the state? Because we cannot leave the state in a captured state, not as good Democrats and as activists of our movement in the broader sense of the word. So first, Acemoglu and Robinson quote another social scientist and economist called Olson, I think it's Marcus Olson, who has studied this matter, and what he suggests and says is that from his studies, the type of leaders a country has and a company has does matter. He suggests that there is a distinct change in the right direction in the growth of both a company and a country once existing leaders who are engaging in the wrong things are replaced and new ones come on the board. Interesting thought to think about as we approach December. Secondly, he also points out, that is Mr. Olson, that Mandela's legacy also points to a distinct dilemma of leadership. That when this wisdom that we talked about in this generation of leaders is retained only amongst the leaders themselves or in the minds of a particularly skilled and trustworthy leader, then with the passing of that leader, for whatever reason, these values and this knowledge and this know-how actually slowly withers away as well. So the challenge that we all have is how do we institutionalize the good things that we've come with from our past, and in particularly over the last 20 years, so that we can sustain it. Of course, part of the object of state capture is in fact to ensure that institutions, both in terms of values and culture and behavior, and in the form of organizations, are diminished in their capacity and are undermined to whatever extent they can be undermined in order that they can undertake the nonsense that they actually engage in. The third point is that ideas matter. And you've seen that in the last 2 to 3 years. Ideas matter both in a positive sense and in a negative sense. And narratives matter equally as well. So in South Africa, our narratives have shifted from the neoliberal sort of narrative, which says the state doesn't matter, privatize everything, the individualism matters most, etc., to one where we try to get a better balance and ask ourselves, how do we introduce in a concrete way, social justice measures that will give us a fairer society and ensure that we have the right kind of balance between growth and those who benefit growth at the end of the day. And a narrative has moved on to the capture narrative that I described earlier on and that you are all familiar with. So the challenge for us is, what is the new narrative for an uncaptured state, or a recapturing process of the state? And what are the key ideas that will underpin that narrative? But ideas and narratives are also linked, as you know, to interests. In other words, if or let me leave myself aside, Derek is a budding tourism entrepreneur, and it's got him tweeting there. And he's going to try, if he is self-centered and individualistic, to create a narrative in government, if he gets back into government, next year sometime, which will reinforce his interests and his type of business associates so that they are the ones who actually benefit, but under the umbrella of tourism is good for this country. So we've also got to ask some serious questions. When ideas actually emerge and narratives emerge, whom do they serve? Which interest groups are they serving? And how do we actually ensure that what we claim that they should be serving, i.e. 55 million people in South Africa, are in fact the people that are being served as well? The next point in this regard is that with a change in leadership, you also have a change in what is called rent-seeking coalitions. Now, I think one of the challenges with us sometimes is that we become so idealistic that we believe that if Derek becomes president, all forms of corruption and rent-seeking will automatically disappear. The fact of the matter is that over human history, as new political and social systems have evolved, different types of rent-seeking is part of those systems. The only question is, how do you control it? How do you minimize it? And one of the points that is being made here is something that we should be vigilant about as we go through this transition in our own country. And that is, what kind of rent-seeking coalitions fall away and what kind of rent-seeking coalitions come into place as we begin to see this transition occurring in our own country as well. The next question we must ask ourselves is, in a recaptured state, what are, in fact, the kind of qualities that we want to see in the next group of leaders or leadership that comes through in December, or more broadly in other organizations as well? And let me suggest to you a few things that you might want to think about and debate once I end. The first is, you hear a lot of talk about unity. And much of the talk about unity actually masks a political interest, as I've just said. You see, if in this contest amongst the 3 people here or the 10 people in the front row there, some of them begin to feel, hey, I might not quite make it, then I rather preach unity. Because once I preach unity, even if one of them wins, they've got to include all of us as well, even if we are losers. And therefore I have a slice of the cake. You get it? You better applaud so that I keep you awake, So that applause wasn't for me, but it was for the concept. So what should be the principles that underlie the best kind of unity that we want to see, once again, both in our own organization and in others as well? And some of the founding principles that this kind of unity should be based upon is that this unity must result in all of us addressing the challenges of jobs, poverty and inequality, and not be diverted from that objective. Secondly, that unity and the people united in that form must serve the national interest, not sectarian interests. And the national interest is often disappearing off the stage. That unity must result in a more inclusive and growing economy, rather than ones that actually satisfy particular economic groups or rent-seeking groups. It must result in a functioning democracy that respects its institutions. I don't think we've had very good examples of that in the recent past. It must assure a functioning judiciary and an effective criminal justice system. I know some of you are saying, dream on. It must, certainly from an ANC point of view, promote and enhance the long-held tradition of collective leadership. We must fight corruption through this unity. We must enhance non-racialism and non-sexism. We must never resort to any form of ethnic or racial chauvinism. And we are reaching points in our political discourse where desperation is resulting in us getting down to lower and lower common denominators in the contestation process. We must condemn gender-based violence and patriarchy. And this next one is much more difficult, but one that we need to keep an eye on as we're learning from Europe. Not utilize populism as a method of resolving political difficulties. And you can get left populism, and you can get right populism, and when both left and right become a lot more aggressive, they meet each other. And you see evidence of that in some instances as well. So how will that kind of unity be crafted? How do we ensure that leaders that come to the fore and leaders that we support are going to actually reflect those kinds of unity that the Mandela and Kathrada generation certainly did? At the same time, leaders will have to acknowledge the material realities of today's South Africa. We're not living in the 1950s or the 1960s any longer. We're living in the 21st century. And there are many objective and subjective obstacles that are beginning to present themselves or exist. The class structure of South Africa is no longer what it was 20 years ago. There's a lot more interested parties, inverted commas, with different types of vested interest in South Africa and its economy and in other things as well, that we need to both understand, respond to, on the one hand, but also guard against in terms of diverting us from the true democracy that we actually want. Secondly, that we have a relatively untransformed economy. That's a fact. And the factor of overconcentration, the marginalization of large percentages of black people in different parts of the country, the kind of spatial segregation that we still have in our cities and towns are all still reflective of the old South Africa. So much more needs to be done over the next 10 to 20 years to change all of that on a lot more urgent and aggressive basis. In the 21st century and the latter part of the 20th century, many have also said that that brand of capitalism or financial capitalism that has been around for the last 15 to 20 years has also generated a particular type of greed and selfishness. The idea of solidarity, the idea of sharing, the idea of assisting does exist in our society, but it is slowly being overwhelmed by the question, what is in it for myself? It is greed that is the driver of the fact that after stealing 10,000, I must get 10 million, and after stealing 10 million, preferably, I must have $500 million, right? And today, the more we hear stories about what goes on, it is no longer about 1 or 2 million. It was always about 50, 100 or 200 million. And it's now approaching the billion mark as well. The reality is that there are still too many unemployed people, particularly young people in South Africa. Poverty is still there, as the Statistician General has pointed out recently. The aspirations of the new urban elite and black elite are no longer being met. There's still too many ceilings that they have to actually contend with. And all of these factors will have to be taken into account as we craft new policies under what might become a new government next year, certainly a new leadership within the dominant political formation in South Africa. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, leadership doesn't exist in some boardroom, sitting on its own, dreaming up ideas, giving instructions that somebody else goes and implement. In the world that we are living in and in the South Africa we are living in, what we mean by leadership is a leadership that is consciously and actively connected with the masses of this country. It is a leadership that understands its task is not just to lead, it is also to mobilize people so that they can lead themselves. Their task is to ensure that mobilization is converted into effective organizations of people at the local level so that they can best defend their interests and advance their interests, but also hold all of us, whoever holds leadership positions in the private, civil society, or political sectors to account at the end of the day. But all of this and the recapture of the state is not going to happen because we attended a lecture here today or a talk tomorrow or participated in a very stimulating discussion. It's going to happen because we are in a position to actually evolve new ways of engaging this reality, new ways of taking on those who are depriving us of the dreams that we articulated in the Freedom Charter, the National Development Plan, and democracy and its principles more generally. So what exactly are those forms of struggle? How exactly are we going to get a better balance between those who have captured parts of the state and use that for their benefit, and ourselves, who are both in political organizations and other organizations or in no organization? And so one of the ways we could do that is certainly through the work of the foundation and others as well. We need a new wave of conscientization in our society, so that it's not just the elites and the intellectuals who are able to connect the dots. People on the ground are also able to connect the dots and understand what are the implications of what is going on for their own day-to-day welfare and position and the future of their children. Secondly, we need more and more amongst us to articulate what will be the new morality that we have to work in terms of politically speaking and otherwise. How do we get to a new society where we are a lot more willing to share and extend solidarity and do things, particularly if we find ourselves in a dominant position in the economy, which will ensure that we, and I've come across some business people who are thinking in this direction, take a slice of the resources that you have and deliberately and consciously create black businesses that actually benefit from your resources so that they can compete with you in the future. How many of us are willing to do that, and how do we go about doing it? But finally, as we've all learned from our own experience as well, hope doesn't come through one of us encouraging the other or some of us encouraging the other. Hope comes because we've mobilized at a grassroots level. We've learned that in recent times, and certainly Comrade Kathy's passing has generated a new period into our history of active mobilization. So how do we all become active? How do we, notwithstanding the fact that Derek and I might be walking around with a walking stick soon, hope not too soon, and however older we might seem compared to the 1970s and 80s and periods before that, how do we become actively involved in one form or another? Otherwise, those who are able, as Cicero said, to be inside the wall and maneuver inside the wall will take this country for themselves at the end of the day. So let me end by quoting, I'm not a Catholic, so let me declare that up front, but Pope Francis is one of my favorite people. And he says the following, in a society so often intoxicated by consumerism and hedonism, wealth and extravagance, appearances and narcissism, we have, interestingly, many narcissistic leaders on the world stage today, as an aside. We are called upon to act soberly, in other words, in a way that is simple, balanced, consistent, capable of seeing and doing what is essential amid a culture of indifference which not infrequently turns ruthless. Our style of life should instead be devout, filled with empathy and compassion and mercy. And I hope that the kind of contribution that this foundation is making to generating that kind of atmosphere in South Africa inspires all of us, not only to witness and analyze the captured state, but participate very actively in recapturing the state, so we in fact generate hope for future generations and create a better South Africa. Thank you very much.